Women disrupting the patriarchy. What took us so long? In addition to thanking Greg G. and his disruption squad for their inexhaustible labors on this online rolling conference, I'd like to revise the wording in my title, changing it from what took us so long to what is taking us so long, replacing the past tense with a present progressive, because the progress toward disrupting my particular professional patriarchy creeps at a petty pace. Let me clarify that at least on my side of the Atlantic, membership in this professional patriarchy of mine, the Anglophone academic classics establishment, has not been limited to fatherly males or even to males. And even its angry young men, those clamoring to belong, by demanding control over what and how we study and teach in our field, thereby grasping for the archy and patriarchy, even those angry young men have female counterparts. I use the conference's official verb, disrupt, to describe developments in our field during the late 1960s and 1970s, a professionally transformative period in the academy responsible for prominently placing the word patriarchy into the working vocabulary of academics, classicists among them. My paper considers how and why that era began to furnish more opportunities for and impose fewer limitations on both ancient and modern women in classics by attracting more serious attention to the lives and images of women in Greek and Roman antiquity and women who study them, and by enabling women classicists to enjoy more favorable conditions of employment and better prospects for academic advancement. It foregrounds the agency and activity of female and male classicists who can claim responsibility for the transformations I will chronicle and for creating the obstacles that made disruption more difficult. So too, it delves into demographic reflections about the North American classics community in particular. To my mind, these demographic details do much to account for who did the transforming and who created and still create the obstacles. Next year, 2022, officially marks the 50th anniversary of the North American Women's Classical Caucus. The WCC started out in 1972 as a committee of our North American Professional Classics Organization, then called the American Philological Association, or APA, and the APA has since been renamed the Society for Classical Studies, or SCS. Our demographic details merit emphasis. 5 of us 6 founders were women, all born here in the USA. Marilyn Arthur Katz, Leona Asher, Sarah B. Pomeroy, Dorothea Schmidt-Wender, and myself. The sole man, John P. Sullivan, was a British emigre. None of us women held tenured academic positions at the time. Sullivan was an Oxbridge-trained, tenured full professor at the State University of New York at Buffalo. 4 of us 5 women were Jewish. The 5th, Wender, was married to a Jew. Sullivan was an Irish Catholic, heavily identified with his working class labor activist roots. All 6 of us, though, shared explicitly feminist goals of minimizing, if not totally erasing, inequalities and asymmetries between men and women in the profession, and of creating more opportunities for and fewer limitations on women, both women in classical antiquity and those who study classical antiquity now. How did these goals translate into practicalities? As scholars, we hope to see more attention accorded to research on the lives and images of ancient Greco-Roman women, with a focus on how their lives and images both resembled and differed from those of similarly situated men. We sought to maximize this attention by including more papers about women in classical antiquity on the annual APA program, by publishing more articles and books on this topic in respected refereed venues, and by integrating this topic into undergraduate and graduate classics curricula. We also aim to improve workplace conditions for women classicists, leveling the playing field by, for example, instituting the anonymous refereeing of abstracts submitted to the program of the annual APA meeting, in those days a revolutionary idea. To our delight, once anonymous refereeing was instituted, APA meetings witnessed a major increase in the number and percentage of papers by women accepted. As the annual APA meeting also functioned as a job market, hosting interviews for available college and university positions for classicists, we sought and achieved major changes in how positions were advertised and how job interviews were conducted. This led to a major increase in the number and percentage of women hired. Yes, we met with some resistance from some males and indeed some females in the patriarchal leadership of the APA. Nevertheless, after expressing both our complaints and our aspirations openly and forthrightly, we successfully convinced patriarchs of both sexes to support these changes. Luckily, the male professional power brokers were of relatively progressive bent and favorably inclined to our cause, owing to positive experiences with their own academically high-achieving undergraduate and graduate women students, not to mention their own academically successful sisters, wives, and daughters. One of them was the 1974 APA president-elect, Professor James H. Oliver of Johns Hopkins. Originally an all-male redoubt, after the retirement in 1915 of the legendary Hellenist and unabashedly white supremacist son of the Confederacy, Basil Linot Gildersleeve, after 1915, Hopkins had bestowed PhDs on several distinguished female classicists, from Helen Henrietta Tanzer of Hunter and Brooklyn Colleges, herself Jewish, in 1929, to Janice Martin Benario of Georgia State University, who was married to Herbert Benario, a Jew, in 1952. Flash forward to the SCS meeting in 2019, which celebrated the association's 150th anniversary. In the 47 years since the WCC's founding, it flourished and prospered. Not only has it continued to organize anonymously peer-reviewed sessions featuring new research about women and gender at each annual meeting, it also awards prizes to recognize outstanding scholarship on women and leadership by women, along with travel subsidies to financially needy members, all funded by its ample treasury. And it has fostered organizational initiatives for other marginalized classicists. First, the Lambda Caucus for LGBTQ, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning classicists. More recently, a counterpart organization, the Women's Classical Committee in the UK. Many WCC members, like myself, are now established senior scholars. Several of us also publish extensively about the history of women in the classics profession here in North America and abroad up to the present day. But for whatever reason, the SCS 150th Anniversary Program Committee included no senior women and only included invited unrefereed papers in the conference and panels it organized, none of them by any senior female classicists researching the history of women in the profession either. This exclusion alone restricted the scope and intellectual quality of the research undertaken and shared in recalling our organizational history. What is more, the male professor charged with program offerings presented papers of his own at two sesquicentennial events first a November 2018 conference in New York City, where the SCS is now headquartered, and then a panel at the annual meeting itself in January 2019. Both papers attempted to chronicle the major changes to the organization and profession over the past 150 and especially the past 50 years, among them the increased presence of women classicists. Flatteringly, he chose to spotlight the accomplishments of the WCC itself in the January 2019 paper. Yet he did not consult any of us WCC founders, although 4 of us are still alive, on its early history. Nor did he cite important new studies about individual women classical scholars prominent in the APA, now SCS, much less mention these scholars themselves. Among them, Elizabeth Hazelton Haight and Grace Harriet McCurdy of Vassar, and Lily Ross Taylor and Agnes Kershaw Blake Michaels of Bryn Mawr. His 2 papers abounded in other errors and omissions too, as became apparent when videos of both papers were posted on the SCS website for the world to see. In December 2018, after I saw the video of the paper presented in New York the previous month, and an abstract of the paper for the January meeting, both of which had been posted online, I contacted several SCS and WCC officers to question the errors and omissions. One was this man's failure to say anything about the highly successful Lambda Classical Caucus and the scholarly and professional accomplishments of LGBTQ classicists. Owing to my entreaties, his actual SCS paper did refer to an article I had written about the WCC in 1988, but his paper was still full of troubling mistakes about the founding of the WCC, and in spite of my entreaties, he still said nothing about the Lambda Caucus, canceling it and its nurturing by the WCC. The SCS peer-reviewed journal, TAPA, acronym for Transactions of the American Philological Association, was slated to publish an invited article version of this man's SCS paper in a special sesquicentennial issue. Colleagues urged me to contact its editors and to ask if I could submit a paper of my own about the topics and facts his paper omitted or misrepresented. I did, and after anonymous refereeing, it was accepted. Focused on the history and leadership of the APA/SCS over the past half century, it looks back to the organization's first century in reflecting on the increasingly prominent role accorded classicists of previously marginalized and indeed excluded backgrounds, not only women, but also Jews, Catholics, Blacks, Asians, gays, emigres, and those from non-privileged backgrounds and non-elite institutions. It also analyzes and surveys how the WCC participated in transforming the APA. But addressing 2 of the major errors in this colleague's paper presented a daunting challenge. First, he did not give the names of us 6 founders, much less provide the demographic details I shared earlier. Yet, and second, he did drop another name by stating, and I quote, "The dripping indignation of Rebel O.P. Oliver, who was tasked with announcing to the business meeting the formation of the WCC, is an indelible memory to those who witnessed it. He could scarcely imagine the creation in 1983 of a child care center at the APA," end of quote. As a founder of the WCC and as a witness to this announcement myself, I needed to dispute this memory. This announcement was not accompanied by dripping indignation, nor was it made by Rebel O.P. Oliver. Confusion between the aforementioned James H. Oliver, professor of classics at the Johns Hopkins University, APA president in 1974, and the palindromically named Rebel O.P. Oliver, professor of classics at the University of Illinois, who never served as an APA officer, appears to explain this error. The error gravely insulted the organization itself, which never legitimated, much less honored, Revelo P. Oliver and his abhorrent views by appointing him to high office in its ranks. Euphemistically described as a polemicist for white supremacist and right-wing causes, Oliver was a vicious, outspoken anti-Semite. By the early 1970s, his two major political allies, the conservative pundit William F. Buckley, founder of the National Review, and Robert W. Welch Jr., founder of the anti-communist John Birch Society, had repudiated him, and Oliver had gone on to found the National Youth Alliance, a white nationalist association, and to serve as editorial advisor to an organization dedicated chiefly to Holocaust denial. To represent Revelo P. Oliver as not only occupying a leadership role in the APA, but also as implicated in its initial begrudging recognition of the WCC, did injustice to both organizations, especially because most of us founders were ourselves Jewish or wed to Jews or both. Why would we want anything to do with an organization led by such a despicable individual? My effort to dispute this elementary error initially met with resistance as well, until a fact-checking visit to the SCS archives by its executive director and others proved me correct. Gratifyingly, the editors of TAPA, holding the author himself accountable, removed those two sentences I just read. Getting this error deleted from the online video, which had been posted for over 8 months before I succeeded, was more difficult. The author had to acknowledge his error publicly, and he has still to do so. But if the efforts of the WCC to be accurately represented in the telling of our own story encountered obstacles of this kind in 2019, it is downright inaccurate to employ the past tense when documenting our record of disruptiveness. Disruption has taken us a half century and then some. The Jewish backgrounds and identities of all 5 female WCC founders are not only relevant in explaining why the substitution of Revelo P. for James Oliver was so disturbing, but also warrant emphasis on other grounds. I have heard the WCC's endeavors to disrupt the APA patriarchy from 1972 onward dismissed as merely furthering an agenda of white women without recognizing important differences among North American white women classicists, especially among North American Jewish women classicists, not all of whom are white. Some are quick to discredit us 5 women, but not Sullivan, despite his Oxbridge academic pedigree, as entitled products of the U.S. educational elite. After all, Wender received her BA and PhD from Harvard, Katz attended Vassar and earned her doctorate from Yale, Pomeroy obtained all of her degrees from Columbia, I hold a Wellesley BA and a Harvard PhD. Demographic details reveal a more complex situation. In 1972, Leona Asher, who had gotten her BA and MA from New York University, was struggling to complete her PhD at Fordham and eking out a living as an adjunct teaching at Adelphi University, all 3 urban commuter institutions. Dorothea Wender received an MA in English at the University of Minnesota between her 2 Harvard stints. Marilyn Arthur Katz finished her undergraduate work by earning a BS and not a BA at Columbia School of General Studies. I, fatherless at 17 and orphaned 3 months after we founded the WCC, had gone to Wellesley on a full scholarship. Other than Sarah Pomeroy, we had all graduated from what we in the U.S. call public and those abroad call state secondary schools. Like John P. Sullivan, a Liverpool stevedore's son who labored his way up to Cambridge and Oxford, we had availed ourselves of upwardly mobilizing, highly competitive academic opportunities to enter the Ivy League. What is more, we needed to overcome Jewish quotas, particularly in an extremely anti-Semitic discipline, and East Coast quotas, as well as unvarnished sexism, to gain admission to these privileged halls of learning. Admittedly, both Katz and Winder were Protestant and not Jewish by birth. Why weren't there more female Protestants or any female Catholics among us WCC founders? By the 1980s, several in both categories had entered our ranks, and I will name them: Phyllis Cullum, Sheila Dickinson, Helena Foley, the late Valerie French, Mary Kay Gamble, Shelley Haley, one of the Catholics and the only Black woman among us, Madeline Henry, Joy King, the late Barbara McManus, Marilyn Skinner. Most of them, significantly, did not have elite East Coast academic backgrounds. Even more significantly, many who joined in our crusade after our founding were also Jewish or married to Jews: Nancy Felsen, Barbara Gold, Nancy Rabinowitz, Amy Richland, Jennifer Roberts, Roma Zeitlin. Our demographic picture resembles that of the women who transformed the study and the profession of English in the U.S. It bears striking similarities to that of second-wave U.S. political feminism in the same years. A 2020 television miniseries about the political movement to pass the Equal Rights Amendment and the successful backlash led by Phyllis Schlafly, a series called Mrs. America, recently dramatized that scenario. Lest we forget, many major players on the U.S. feminist team were Jewish: Bella Abzug, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Brenda Fagan, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, although several of the actresses portraying them were non-Americans and or Gentiles. Perhaps our experience in the WCC, that of female classicists willing to take a stand and take a risk in 1972, can also illuminate the disproportionate presence of Jewish women in these undertakings. To our surprise, we encountered immediate resistance from several alumni and faculty of the one elite women's college that awarded the PhD, Bryn Mawr, a Protestant stronghold and distinctive for that reason as well. By the early 70s, most U.S. private universities awarding the classics PhD had hired both Jews and Catholics to their faculties. Perhaps not insignificantly, while my own classics professors at the all-female Wellesley College in the early 1960s included both a Jew, Mary Rosenthal Lefkowitz, and a Roman Catholic, Barbara Philippa McCarthy, other women's colleges such as Mount Holyoke, Smith, and Vassar had yet to appoint faculty in either category. Bryn Mawr had only hired one, Myra Uhlfelder, a medieval Latinist. In those days, multiple martyrs, as Bryn Mawr graduates and faculty affectionately labeled themselves, would confess to espousing feminist values, but saw little or no value in studying or teaching women in antiquity, or employing gender as a category of analysis, or publicly identifying with a political movement connected with raised voices, open discussions of sexuality, and yes, disruption. While quite a few benefited from what the WCC accomplished, they found us indecorous and troublesome, antithetical to WASP ideals. Some of us WCC activists had attended women's colleges and studied with women faculty, but still lacked female scholarly role models. The pre-World War II generation of women classicists had numbered 2 female Vassar professors intrigued with the women of Greek and Roman antiquity, prolific researchers both: Grace McCurdy, who investigated historical figures such as Hellenistic and Roman vassal queens, and Elizabeth Hazelton Haight, who examined the roles of women in ancient novels. Strikingly, McCurdy came from a working-class immigrant family that had changed the spelling of their name from MCC to MAC to get jobs in the New England of no Irish need apply signs. Haight, of modest family origins, wrote more for students and her fellow teachers than specialists. Yet neither commanded the same kind of scholarly respect as that lavished on Bryn Mawr, Taylor, and Michaels, who wrote more conventional works of scholarship recognized by the APA Goodwin Award of Merit. The Jewish women involved in launching the WCC by no means represented all Jewish female classicists in the U.S. Several of the Jews hired to U.S. classics positions during the 4 decades before 1972 were women who had fled Nazi-occupied Germany and Austria, women who were by then in their 40s and 50s. Some of them, Gabriela Schifflich Hönigswald, who taught as an adjunct in several prestigious Philadelphia colleges and universities, and Gerda Kroner-Seligson, a tenured professor at Michigan, were married to men, and some were mothers, indeed mothers of daughters. Others, such as Vera Lachman of Brooklyn College, were lesbians. Whatever their circumstances, they did not evince support for our feminist efforts. After the trauma they endured by being considered politically toxic in the lands of their birth, perhaps they feared rocking the boat. Perhaps they wished to validate themselves by producing traditional Germanic scholarship, or might wish both. Some senior Jewish women classicists born in the US of A also kept their distance. Miriam Dressler Griffin, who married a British Don while doing graduate work in the UK and pursued a career at Somerville College, Oxford. Ethel Renee Wolfe of Brooklyn College, who impressively made her mark as an academic administrator above the fray. At a 1973 conference on women in antiquity, organized by John Sullivan, Miriam Drapkin of the City College of New York privately shared with me her sympathy for feminist endeavors, but felt it was too late for her as she neared her 60th birthday to sign on. Being born in the US during the 1930s and 1940s, and coming of age in the time of the civil rights movement and other struggles for equality and equity, appear to be the empowering factors for WCC founders and facilitators. We believe we could attain justice and demand accountability rather than protect an academic status quo that was patently unfair. While we needed male allies such as John Sullivan, that alliance came at a cost. His gleefully cultivated reputation for sexual profligacy made the women who shared merely his academic interests targets of opprobrium. My own Wellesley professors chastised me for associating with him and thereby allowing him to tarnish my reputation as a serious scholar. Some men who championed feminist teaching and research did take unconscionable sexual advantage, especially those in powerful professional positions such as journal editors and department chairs entrusted with hiring. To avoid the appearance of casting couch careerism and to minimize the power of sexually exploitative male patrons, we insisted on the adoption of what used to be called meritocratic assessment protocols and what I now would call accountability and justice procedures, such as anonymous refereeing and fair hiring practices, and always on a level playing field. We thereby proved that we were as qualified and as competent as men being considered for the same opportunities by grounding our textual analyses in close readings to establish that we hadn't forsworn philology in favor of theory, by scrutinizing material evidence as well as literary works to provide socio-historical context for wider cultural claims, and by inclusive citation of earlier research to show it the respect we accorded all scholars and all scholarship. Meanwhile, Jewish quotas and East Coast quotas, at least for Jews, did not disappear overnight. New stigmas arose. The charges that we were only hired because we were women, and that we were taking away jobs and space in journals and slots in the programs of professional meetings from better qualified and more financially needy men. It was exhausting to prove our academic worth to the men of our father's generation, imbued as they were with certain prejudices. For example, that women with professional husbands don't need to hold jobs. Many of the male patriarchs had attended all male schools and universities and had never had women colleagues, much less female bosses previously. Yet they were open to persuasion. Dealing with the resentments expressed by men of our own and of our sons' generations who have learned and worked in coeducational environments under female bosses has been far more frustrating. Disrupting our professional classics patriarchy in order to integrate feminism into classical studies has required patience, diplomacy, and accommodation to the expectations of others, along with persistence and a commitment to attaining justice and accountability, I should add. We were not seeking special favors. I confess to harboring anxieties about granting privileges to some, but not all women, because favoritism, which reigns supreme in the old boys network that the WCC spent years challenging, undermines claims to justice and accountability. While I regard the Women's Classical Caucus as having successfully proven the validity and value of women as both subjects of study and researchers in these frightening times of academic cutbacks and crises, I do worry that we may need to make our case again. Thank you.